Hello, Ken here. So welcome to the 5-day challenge on how to play chess. So I'm going to be walking you through chess training over the next 5 days. So today is going to be day 1, and I hope you enjoy the lessons. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to share my screen here so that we can start. All right, so hopefully you can see my screen here. So what we have here is the chessboard. And it's good to get an understanding of the landscape of the game. And the best way to do that is to start by understanding the chessboard itself. So if you look at the chessboard, there are a total of 64 squares on the chessboard. And if you pay attention here, you see that the colors alternate. We have a black square here, then white, black, white, black, white, black, and white. So this is how the chessboard is structured. So there are 64 squares in total. There are 8 on each side. So if we count from left to right here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if we count from bottom to up, we also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So when you multiply 8 by 8, you get 64. So there are a total of 64 squares on the chessboard. You also notice that half of those squares are white and the other half is black. So we have 32 of these squares that are black and another 32 that are white. Right, and so this is the entire landscape of the chessboard. When we play the game, this is how we play the game. And when you're setting up the board, you set it up in such a way that you have the white square on your right-hand side. So that's important because you don't want to set it up the other way where you have the black square on your right-hand side. You always want to have the white square on your right-hand side when you're playing chess. So this is a board, and one of the ways to get good at chess is to visualize the board, right? So in chess, you visualize quite a bit in chess. Chess is all about visualization, all about strategizing, and so you want to get a clear understanding of the board itself in terms of how the squares are structured, in terms of the patterns of the squares. And so I'm gonna pull up another board where we'll label all the different squares, because every square on the chessboard has a name. So in this chessboard that I just put up, you'll notice that we've labeled all the squares. So on the horizontal side, going from left to right, we've labeled the square. So we have the A, B, C, D, E, F, G up to H. And you also find that we've numbered them from bottom to up, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 8. So let's go through some terminologies here for chess. And then we'll start to name each of the squares. So in chess, you'll find that we have the rows. So the rows, we also call them the ranks. So these are the squares that go from left to right. So in this case, we have the first row, and you see by the number 1, we have the first row. So all of these squares here are on the first row. If you go up, we have the second row, we have the third row, the fourth row, and so on to the 5th row. Right, and we call those ranks in chess. Right, so we have the first rank, second rank, third rank, fourth rank, all the way to the 8th rank. And then we have the columns, which are the vertical axis, right? So, and we have those labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. In chess, we call these the files, right? Files, F-I-L-E-S, right? So we have the files. So we have the A file, we have the B file, C file, we have the D file, E file, F file, G, and H file. So in chess, we have the chessboard, which is the entire landscape of where we play the game. We have the files, which are labeled A to H, and the files run from bottom to top or from top to bottom. And we also have the ranks labeled 1 to 8, first rank all the way to the 8th rank. And the ranks run from left to right, right or right to left. Right, so that is the terminology. So in addition to that, we have what we call the diagonals. So if you pay attention here, you see there are the two longest diagonals are these ones here that run from A1 here all the way to H8. We have another diagonal here that runs from H1 all the way to A8. So we have the diagonals. And if you notice here, you see that these diagonals have retained the same colors. So for example, this black diagonal runs all the way, and all black squares. They also alternate. You see the white diagonals that go all the way, and you see the black diagonals followed by the white diagonals. And as you go from the middle of the board towards the end, the number of squares reduce, right? And so those are the diagonals in the chessboard, and that's how they work. So now let's look at the names of the different squares. So here you have all the squares all named. So this is A1 because we have the letter A and the number 1. And so that represents the name of that square. We have B1, C1, D1, E1, all the way to H1. We also have, if I come here, we have B5. If I come to this square here, so that will be G5. If I go to that square here, that will be G7. If I go to that square here, that will be B8. So all the squares have a name. So one of the ways to visualize the board, if you're good at the game, is to be able to name these squares even without looking at the board. For example, if I ask you to tell me whether the square D4 is white or black, you should be able to tell me that by looking and by memorizing and visualizing the boards and the different squares. So in this case, as you can see, the square D4 is a black square. The square E4 is a white square. The square B7 is a white square. The square H8 is a black square. So one of the exercises I'll get you to do in your homework today on day 1 is to memorize all the different squares, understand the different colors and the different positions of all the different squares, so that without looking at the board, you should be able to tell the color of all these different squares. You should be able to name all the different squares on the chessboard. So that's very important. That's a good concept to understand when you're playing chess, to be able to visualize the board and all the different squares. Okay, so next, I want to go through the game and all the different pieces. So again, this is another chessboard here. As you can see, we have all the different names of the square. If I highlight the square here, so this is E4. If I go here and I highlight another square, that is C6. If I highlight the square here, we know that is G7. If I highlight this one here, that is E2. And then we know all the different diagonals, right? So this is the longest diagonal that runs from A1 to H8. And this is a diagonal that is all on the green. In this case, there are green and white squares. So this is all on the green squares. You notice that the diagonals all retain the same colors. And then if we go to the next diagonal here, That is the diagonal that runs from A2 to G8. And then if we go again, this is another diagonal here that runs from A5 to D8. Okay. And so this is chess, and this is how you understand all the different patterns of the board. Okay, so next, what I want us to do now is to go through all the pieces. I'm gonna briefly walk you through how all the different pieces move on the chessboard. And then we'll go set up the board and perhaps play our first game. Okay. All right, so first we're gonna start with the pawns. So the pawns, there are 8 pawns on the chessboard, and I'm gonna put all the white pawns here. And I'm putting the pawns here because this is the starting position of the pawns when we are starting the game of chess. 8 pawns on the white side, 8 pawns on the black side. Now, if you notice, all the white pawns are on the second rank. Because I told you how to rearrange the chessboard, right? You want to have the white square on your right-hand side, and we have all the pawns on the second rank for white, and for black, all the pawns are on the 7th rank. So the positions are identical. So each player has 8 pawns, and the pawns move forward, right? So let's go through the movement of the pawns. On the first move of each pawn, you can move the pawn either 1 square or you move the pawns 2 squares. Right, so anytime you move a pawn on the first move, the very first move, you can either move 1 square or 2 squares. For example, if I want to move this pawn now, I can choose to move this pawn 2 squares to E4 in this case. If it's my move to play again, I can choose to move this one 1 square to D3. So for the pawns, let me repeat that again for the pawns. The first move of each pawn, you can either move 1 square or 2 squares. Now, after the first move, you can only move 1 square at a time. So this pawn can only move to this square. This pawn can only move to this square. So after the first move, you can only move 1 square at a time. So now I can move this pawn to that square. If it's my turn to move again, I can move this to that square. If it's black's turn to move, black can move this pawn to that square. And if it's black's turn to move again, black can move that pawn 2 squares to that square. Now, the pawn does not move backwards, so I cannot move my pawn backwards. So that's one of the rules in chess. The pawns cannot move backwards. Now, if there's something in front of the pawn, so in this case, there's a pawn here in front of my pawn. When there is something in front of my pawn, directly in front of my pawn, the pawn can no longer move. So this pawn here is stuck. This pawn can no longer move because there is a pawn right in front of it. So when the pawn is blocked in front, the pawn cannot move. So now we know how the pawn moves. The first move, you can either move 1 square or 2 squares. After the first move, you can only move 1 square forward. The pawns cannot move backwards. And this is how they move. So now when we think of how to capture, so if it's black to move now, black can, oh no, that's not what I want to do. If it's black to move now, black can move this pawn here, all right? So when we are looking at capturing, the pawns capture diagonally. So this pawn here can capture diagonally along those diagonal, directly diagonal to it. So if I have an enemy pawn on this square or on this square, then my pawn on G2 on the next move, I can capture that pawn. Okay, so that's how the pawn moves. They move forward, but they capture directly diagonal. So if it's black to move and black moves their pawn to this square, and now it's white to move, I can capture that pawn because that is directly diagonal to me. So now if I want to play as white, I can make a move like that. And when I capture, I take the black pawn and I put my pawn on that square. And now if it's black to play, black can do the same, capture my pawn and put the pawn on that square. Okay. So that is how the pawn moves. The pawn moves forward on the first move of each pawn, and they don't move backwards. On the first move, you can move one square or two squares. After the first move, you can only move one square at a time. Now, there's something special about the pawn. When the pawn gets to the end of the board, so let's say I move my pawn 2 squares and I keep moving my pawn, and my pawn gets to the end of the board. When the pawn gets to the end of the board, the pawn can be promoted to any piece. Can be promoted to a bishop, can be promoted to a knight, can be promoted to a rook, or better, it can be promoted to a queen. So when a pawn gets to the end of the board, the pawn can be promoted. Okay. All right, so now let's look at the next piece. So I want to go through the bishop. So now we've looked at the pawn, and the next piece I want to look at is the bishop. So if you look at the bishop, in this case, it has like a cross sign on it. And so you can tell what the bishop is just by looking at the shape of the piece, right? And so that is the bishop. And you notice that there are 2 bishops on each side. So white has 2 bishops, black has 2 bishops. Okay. So you also notice that if you look at the 2 bishops on the white side, one is sitting on the white square and the other one is sitting on the dark square, right? So in this case, one is on the white square and the other one is on the dark square, right? So this is on the white square, that is on a green square. So the bishops move diagonally. So let's say I move my pawn. Get my pawn back. So let's say I move my pawn to that square and I move my pawn to that square. Now the bishops move diagonally. So this bishop can move along this white diagonal, and this bishop can move along this black or dark diagonal. So that's how the bishop moves. The bishops will move along the diagonals. And if it's my move to play as white, I can play my bishop to that square. And from this square, then my bishop can cover all this diagonal. Not that. Can come to that diagonal, can go all the way to that diagonal. And like that, right? So that's how the bishop moves. So the bishop moves diagonally. And as you can see, because of the nature of the movement of the bishop, it means that this bishop that is on the green square will always remain on the green square, because the bishop can only move along the green diagonals. The same with this bishop that is on the white square. So this bishop can only move along the white diagonals. So if I move this bishop to this diagonal, it means this bishop can only move along these white diagonals, right? And this is how the bishop captures as well. So the bishop captures the same way it moves. So if it's my move to play as white, I can capture this pawn here because that pawn is right on my diagonal. And if I have to play this bishop, I can also capture that pawn here because that pawn on c7 is right on this diagonal where my bishop is. So the bishop cannot jump over pieces. So in this case, if it's black to move, black cannot move any bishop right now because these bishops are blocked. This one particularly is blocked by these 2 pawns. And this bishop here is blocked by these 2 pawns. Right, so to move your bishop, you have to move a pawn away. So in this case, black, In this case, if it's black to move, black has to move this pawn to be able to move this bishop maybe to this diagonal. So now you can move the bishop to this diagonal, right? In this case, this bishop cannot move. To move this bishop, you have to move a pawn out, and then you can move your bishop out. Okay, so that's how the bishop moves. So again, to repeat, the bishop moves diagonally. There are two bishops on each side of the board, one on the white square and the other one on the dark square. All right, so next, let's look at the knight. So the knight is a piece that looks like a horse. Right, some people will call it a horse, but the right name is the knight. So again, you notice there are two knights on each side. Black has two knights on each side. And if you notice the way I'm placing the pieces, this is how we place the pieces when we're about to start the game of chess. So the pawns in front and the other pieces behind the pawns. So the bishops are on the c5 and f5, and the knight on the b5 and g5. So the knights are directly beside the bishop, right, going towards the end of the board. Okay, so how does the knight move? So the knight is the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So the knight moves in L form. So this knight on this square can move to this square, or it can come to this square. So the knight moves in L form. So what you do, you count two squares in one direction. In this case, we count 1, 2, and then you count one square, either right or left. Right, so if I have to move this knight, I'll count 1, 2, and then I can go right. So this knight can move to that square. Or I can count 1 square and 2 in another direction. So I can count 1 and 2. So this knight can go, so this knight can move here to that square. So either way, you notice that the knight makes an L-shaped movement. So I can move this knight here. This one can come here. And if it's my turn to move this knight again, I can move it to that square. My turn to move this knight, I can move it to that square. And so you see that the knight moves in L form. And something else you notice is that if the knight is on a dark square, in this case, a green square, on his next move, is going to land on a white square. So it is impossible for a knight to move from a white square to another white square, just based on how it moves. So the knight has to move in alternating colors. So from white square on its next move, it to move to a dark square. And that's how the knight captures as well. So from this position, the knight can capture this pawn by taking it, right? The knight can also capture this pawn by taking it. And so if I want to capture this pawn, for example, I'll take my knight and I'll put there and I take the pawn away. So that's how the knight moves. So the knight moves in L form, and that's how it captures as well. And it is the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So the final thing I want you to notice about the knight is that the knight on the center of the board has a lot more influence. So when we're playing the game of chess, we want to move our knight closer to the center of the board. So if I have this knight here, this knight can go to this square, can go to this square, that square, that square, that square. And assuming I don't have a pawn here or a pawn here, then the knight can also come to these squares. Right, so if you count, the knight on the center can go to 8 different squares from this position. So it makes the knight very powerful in the center. Now let's assume we put the knight on the side of the board. If we put the knight on the side of the board, then this knight can come to this square, to that square, to that square, to that square. So now, by moving the knight from the center of the board to the side of the board, the knight can only go to 4 different squares. So you've cut the power of the knight in half just by moving it away from the center of the board to the side of the board. And then if I put the knight in the corner of the board, the knight can only go to those 2 squares from the corner of the board. Again, the power of the knight is reduced further if you put it on the corner of the board, because the knight can only go to those 2 different squares from this position. Okay, so that's how the knight moves. So the knight moves in L form. You count 2 squares in one direction and 1 square in another direction. The knight is the only piece that can jump over other pieces. All right, so from this position, I can move the knight. The knight in the center of the board has more influence, can go to 8 different squares. It's much better to have the knight in the center of the board than to have it on the side of the board where it can only go to 4 different squares. And it's much better to have it on the corner of the board where it can only go to 2 different squares. Okay, so that's how the knight moves. So next, let's look at the rook. So the rook, we have 2 rooks on each side. And as you can see here, we have the 2 black rooks on the h5, and then we have another rook on the a5. So 2 rooks for white. And this is where we'll place the rooks when we're starting the game. We'll put them right at the corner of the board. Right, so now you see the pattern in terms of how we arrange the pieces. So we have the rooks followed by the knight and the bishops. Okay, so the rook, has a simple way of moving. So the rook only moves along the files and along the ranks. So this rook, for example, can only move along those files and it can move along this rank. If I have this rook here in the middle here, the rook can go that way or that way, and the rook can go that way or this way. Right, so that's how the rook moves. It's a simple way of moving. It just moves vertically, horizontally, or in this case, it moves along the files and along the ranks on the chessboard. And that's how it captures as well. So this rook here, if it's my turn to play, I can capture that pawn there. And to capture it, I take the pawn out and I place my rook on that spot where the pawn was. Okay, so that's how the rook moves. In this starting position, the rook cannot move because the rook is sort of trapped. There are pieces around it. So for me to move this rook, I have to first move my pawn. And now I can move my rook to this square or to that square. And on my next move, I can move to any of the squares here. Okay, so that's how the rooks move. So now let's talk about the queen. All right, so you'll notice that there is 1 queen on each side. The queen is on the d file. So the white queen here on d1, the black queen on d8. So the queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard. And the reason for that is because it combines the movement of the bishop and the movement of the rook. So that means the queen moves along the files and the ranks of the chessboard, so vertically, horizontally, and it also moves diagonally. Okay, and the queen, unlike the knight, cannot jump over other pieces. So in this case, the queen can only move to, assuming I have to move my queen. Hold on, let me get my queen back. Assuming I have to move my queen from this position, I can only move it to this square. I can't move it anywhere else because the queen is all blocked by pieces around it, right? And so if we want to make our queen powerful, we have to move things away from it. Right, so in this position, I can move my queen along that diagonal, I can move my queen there. I can move it back. I can move it along there. So let's say I have this pawns here and I have my queen right here in the middle. Then my queen can move along all of these different positions, right? So the queen just essentially moves in all directions. Right, so that's why the queen is so powerful. It moves in all directions. So from this position, I can capture that pawn. The queen can capture that pawn. I can capture that pawn, right? Because the queen can move diagonally and vertically along the files. Okay, so that's how powerful the queen is. So if I move this pawn here, then this queen can move all the way to that square. On the next move, I can come all the way there. And so, you know, that's why the queen is a powerful piece, just because of the way it moves. All right, so finally, let's look at the king. Okay, so the king is right beside the queen. The king is on the e5, as you can see here. Again, there's one king on each side. And the way you know the king, you see the crown on top of the king. It has a plus sign, unlike the crown on top of the queen, which is sort of different. Right, it has all these 5 different stars, more or less. Okay, so that is the piece. So now you see how the whole chessboard is arranged. We have all the pieces now on the chessboard. In terms of how the king moves, the king, just like the queen, moves in all directions. Right? The king moves in all directions. But unlike the queen, the king only moves one square at a time. So in this position, the king cannot move because it's surrounded. It is surrounded by all these pieces around it. So if I have to move my king, so let's say I move this pawn away, I can now move my king to that square. Okay, so if the king is here, for example, I can only move one square at a time. So this king can only move to these squares around it. Right, the king can only go one square at a time. So my next move, I can go to that square, or I can go to that square. So one square at a time. So I can just move to that square. And that's how the king captures as well. So let's say this pawn is here and it's my turn to move. The king can capture that pawn. And I can just go and capture the pawn. Okay. So we've spent some time, we've gone through all the names and different pieces. We've looked at how the pieces move. We've talked about the pawns, that they move forward, either 2 squares or 1 square in the first move. We talked about the bishops, they move diagonally. The knights move in L form. We've talked about the rooks, they move horizontally, they move vertically and horizontally. We know the queen combines the movement of the bishop and the rook. And we know the king moves like the queen, but only 1 square at a time. So now let's look at the chessboard again. This is how we arrange the chessboard. So we have all the pawns in front. In this case, the white pawns on the 2nd rank, the black pawns on the 7th rank. Then we have all the main pieces behind. So we have the king, the queen, king on E, queen on D. Then immediately following the king and queen, we have the bishops beside them, followed by the knights, and then the rooks. Right, so this is your chessboard. So one more thing before we end the class today. We will go through what I call the value of the pieces. And so let me show you that quickly. Because it's important to understand the value of the pieces because it helps you when you're playing the game. Remember, I did mention that the queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard. So if you're looking at this in dollar terms, the queen here is going to be worth $9 or 9 points. So that's why the queen is the most powerful piece, is the strongest piece. The rook is worth 5 points, in this case, $5, followed by the bishops and the knights. They are worth 3 each. And lastly, we have the pawn that is worth just $1 or 1 point. So when you're playing the game of chess, you don't want to exchange your queen that is valued at $9 for a pawn that is valued at $1. So that's not a fair trade, right? So that's why it's important to know the value of the pieces. You will notice that the king is not here. And the reason is because the king is priceless, right? The whole purpose of the game of chess is to capture the king or to trap the king. In chess, we call that a checkmate, right? So the purpose of chess is to checkmate the king. So the player with the white pieces will be playing to get to a position where they checkmate the black king or they trap the king. And the king is checkmated when the king has no safe square to move to. In other words, the king has no place to run to. And when that happens, we know the king is checkmated. Okay, so now let's quickly go through a game. But I want to show you the fastest checkmate in chess. So if white starts the game by playing pawn to g4, black can play this, his pawn to e5. And let's say white makes a mistake and plays another pawn to f3. Then black now can make a move. And this is what we call checkmate. Because now the queen is attacking the king. And now it's white to play, but white has to move this king to a safe square. In this case, white cannot move the king because he can't come to this square because there's a bishop there. He cannot go to that square because there's a pawn there. He cannot go to that square because there's another pawn there. He can't come here because there's a queen there. It can't come to this square because this square is controlled by the black queen. It cannot block this square because there is no piece that can go to this square or to that square. Remember, the pawns cannot move back. And so this is what we call checkmate. Checkmate in 2 moves. So this is the fastest checkmate in chess. Okay, so on day 2, we're going to review additional concepts in the game of chess. And we do some more in day 3, day 4, and day 5. So for now, go through your assignments, practice your game, and then play some games. So yes, you got to start playing some games even today, right now. And so what I suggest you do, go to chess.com, open an account in chess.com, and then play some games. And you'll see some of the assignments I will give you in the instructions to follow. And so you complete those assignments. There are some quizzes to complete as well. And once you do that, then you'll be on your way to day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. And by day 5, you'll be a master of the game. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. So have a good one. Bye.